Bobo Brazil was one of wrestling's biggest stars, a champion and a hero to millions. But for every hero, there must be a villain. Over his long career, Brazil faced off against some of the most ruthless, arrogant, and wild characters wrestling had to offer. And if you only watched the matches, you'd think these 6 wrestlers absolutely despised him. Here are 6 wrestlers who hated Bobo Brazil, at least in the ring. Let's start with the Sheik. If there was ever a feud that looked real, it was this one. Bobo and the Sheik fought all over the place, mostly in Detroit, but also in cities like Toledo, Cleveland, and even out in California and Tennessee. Their matches were wild. The Sheik didn't play by any rules. He threw fire, jabbed people with pencils, bit opponents, and just created total chaos. He wasn't just a bad guy, he was a madman. Bobo, on the other hand, was calm and cool. He was the kind of hero people wanted to cheer for. Strong, respectful, and not afraid to stand his ground. The way these two clashed was magic. Their matches rarely had a clean finish. Most ended in a disqualification or just complete mayhem. But fans loved it and kept coming back for more. And here's the wild part. Even though they made it look like they truly hated each other, off camera they had serious respect. They were so committed to their feud that they stayed in character, even during holidays. According to the Sheik's nephew, Sabu, Bobo used to come over to their house during family get-togethers, and he and the Sheik wouldn't even speak. Not because they had a real problem, but because they wanted to protect the story. That's how much they cared about the fans and the business. Next up was Nature Boy Buddy Rogers. This rivalry was less violent and more about personality. Rogers was everything Bobo wasn't. He was loud, flashy, arrogant, and loved to show off. He strutted around the ring, cheated whenever he could, and always made sure the crowd hated him. Bobo was the opposite, quiet, strong, and full of integrity. That contrast made their matches really fun to watch. One of the biggest moments in their rivalry happened in 1962. Bobo actually beat Rogers for the NWA World Heavyweight Championship, but Rogers claimed he was injured going into the match. So Bobo, staying true to his good guy image, refused to accept the win. Because of that, the title change wasn't officially recognized. This was a common storyline trick back then. It was meant to make the hero look honorable and keep the belt on the heel a little longer. Even though it might have looked like real conflict, it was all part of the plan. In fact, Bobo and Rogers teamed up in tag matches from time to time. You don't work that closely with someone if you actually dislike them. They were professionals who knew how to put on a great show. Then there was Killer Kowalski. He had one of the scariest reputations in wrestling. He wasn't flashy like Rogers or wild like the Sheik. He was just intense. His matches were hard-hitting, and he had a signature move called the stomach claw that looked absolutely brutal. Whenever he faced Bobo, the vibe in the building changed. It felt serious. But what made their rivalry even more important was what it represented. Back in the 1960s, wrestling was still segregated in many places. Black wrestlers were often only allowed to wrestle other black wrestlers. But Bobo and Kowalski broke that barrier. In Alexandria, Virginia, they wrestled in one of the first major interracial matches in the area. That match helped push the sport forward. It wasn't just entertainment. It was history. And again, no real hate here. Both men were eventually inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame, Bobo in 1994, Kowalski in 1996. They may have played enemies in the ring, but behind the scenes, they were both pros who helped each other elevate the business. Kowalski's aggressive style was just his gimmick. He treated all his opponents the same, with intensity, but with respect. Another name that often comes up when talking about Bobo Brazil's toughest opponents is Dick the Bruiser. If you've ever seen one of their matches, you know exactly why. These two didn't wrestle, they fought. Their matches were full of hard punches, slams, and chaos. Dick the Bruiser wasn't just a character name, it was who he was in the ring. A true brawler with a reputation for being as real and raw as they come. And when he went up against Bobo, you could feel the tension in the building. For fans, it looked like these two hated each other. They were both big, physical guys, and neither one backed down. When they got in the ring, it felt less like a match and more like a bar fight with ropes. Their rivalry helped define the Detroit territory in the 60s and 70s, a territory known for being gritty and hard-hitting. But despite how real it all looked, There's no reason to think Bobo and Dick the Bruiser had any personal issues. In fact, all signs point to the opposite. Behind the scenes, they work together often, not just as opponents, but as tag team partners. That alone tells you a lot. For example, in 1974, Bobo and Dick the Bruiser actually teamed up and beat Bobby Heenan and the Sheik, two of the biggest heels of the time. Think about that for a second. Two guys who were supposed to hate each other, standing side by side as partners? That doesn't happen if there's real-life heat, and it didn't just happen once. In 1983, they teamed up again, this time against Abdullah the Great and Jerry Valiant. These weren't one-off pairings. This was a pattern, a sign that they trusted each other, respected each other, and were willing to work together when the story called for it. Ox Baker, a well-known wrestler who shared the ring with both Bobo and Dick the Bruiser many times, backed this up in interviews. He talked about wrestling both men dozens of times and never hinted at any bad blood between them. To him, they were just two professionals doing their job and putting on a show. And that's really what it comes down to. What you saw in the ring was two big men going to war, brawling, bleeding, and looking like they wanted to tear each other apart. But off camera, it was all business. They knew how to sell a fight and keep the crowd engaged, but once the match was over, they shook hands and moved on. That's the kind of professionalism that made the territory system work, and made rivalries like theirs so memorable. Their in-ring styles were naturally rough, and that only made their matches look more intense. But that shared toughness wasn't a sign of real hate. It was just a sign that they both brought everything they had into the ring. They didn't need to go easy on each other because they could handle it. It was mutual respect, not rivalry, that made it all work. Speaking of tough, another name who had a long-running and physical feud with Bobo Brazil was Johnny Valentine. Now, Valentine had a reputation for being one of the most believable wrestlers of his time. He didn't just wrestle, he made every match feel like a struggle. Everything he did looked like it hurt, and most of the time, it probably did. Fans believed his matches were real because he made them feel real. And when he locked up with Bobo, it was no different. The two faced each other many times and their matches were always intense. It was one of those rivalries that looked personal. Valentine was stiff, Brazil was powerful. Together, they brought out the best and hardest hitting in each other. But again, as believable as it all seemed, there's no actual evidence that they didn't get along in real life. In fact, there's a story from 1973 that completely flips the idea of real hatred on its head. One night at the Cobo Arena in Detroit, the Sheik attacked Johnny Valentine during a match and used a fireball, one of his signature weapons. The crowd was shocked, but what really surprised people was what happened next. Bobo Brazil, Valentine's supposed rival, came into the ring to check on him. He made sure he was okay. And it wasn't just part of the show. It was a genuine moment of concern. That alone speaks volumes. If there had been real-life issues between them, Bobo wouldn't have been out there helping. Wrestlers didn't do that unless they had some kind of bond, or at the very least, mutual respect. But it didn't stop there. Just 6 months after that incident, Bobo and Valentine actually teamed up. Yep, they went from enemies to tag partners, teaming up to take on Pampero Firpo and the Sheik at the very same Cobo Arena. That match was a big deal. The place was sold out, the story was strong, and fans were excited to see these two former enemies working together. Again, you don't partner with someone you truly dislike. Wrestling feuds are built on trust. You have to trust the person you're fighting, and you definitely have to trust the person in your corner. The fact that Bobo and Valentine could switch from rivals to allies proves that what we saw in the ring was just part of the show. It also shows how flexible wrestling could be back then. 1 month you could be at each other's throats. The next you could be fighting side by side, all depending on what the promoters needed and what the story demanded. And only true professionals could pull that off without ego or drama getting in the way. Bobo and Valentine both understood that. They weren't just working for themselves. They were working for the bigger picture, and they did it well. Their matches were believable because they were good at what they did, not because they didn't get along. When it came down to it, they were both pros, and they treated the business with respect. Another name that sometimes pops up when people talk about Bobo Brazil's rivals is Haystacks Calhoun. But let's be real. If you're calling this one a rivalry, it was more for show than anything else. Haystacks Calhoun was a massive guy, over 600 pounds. He was built like a mountain and played up his big, friendly farm boy character to the max. He came across like a giant you didn't want to mess with, but also someone kind-hearted and easygoing. When he stepped into the ring with Bobo Brazil, the crowd couldn't help but notice the size difference. Bobo was strong and respected, but Haystacks looked like he could sit on a guy and end the match right there. Their matches were more about fun storytelling than real conflict. It was the classic setup. Could the smaller, faster guy take down the giant? That kind of visual always got fans excited. But despite how different they looked in the ring, the two were actually friends and partners, not enemies. In fact, Bobo and Haystacks teamed up in tag matches many times over the years. One example, they wrestled together against Man Mountain Cannon and John Quinn. Not exactly the kind of thing you do with someone you hate. They were even described as forming one of Haystacks' best tag teams. So it's pretty clear, any idea of hatred between them was just part of the act. This is a great reminder of how wrestling works. Just because two wrestlers face each other in the ring doesn't mean there's any bad blood behind the scenes. The whole thing is performance. They're telling a story, giving the crowd something to cheer or boo. And that's what Bobo and Haystacks did. They played their roles, gave the fans a good show, and probably went out for dinner afterward. Out of all the so-called rivals Bobo had, this one might be the clearest example of where kayfabe, wrestling's word for keeping the storyline alive, ends and real life begins. There was no tension, no drama, just two pros doing their jobs, making each other look good, and entertaining the audience. They may have played opponents on some nights, but more often than not, they were tag partners. And that takes trust. And that's really the key takeaway from all of these stories. Whether it was Haystacks or the Sheik, Buddy Rogers, Killer Kowalski, Dick the Bruiser, or Johnny Valentine, Bobo Brazil's most famous rivalries were built on respect, not hate. Let's take a step back and look at the full picture. With the Sheik, Bobo was part of one of the bloodiest, most intense feuds in wrestling history. Fans believed they hated each other, but in real life, they were so committed to keeping up appearances that they wouldn't even talk at family gatherings, just to protect the illusion. That takes serious respect and dedication to the craft. With Buddy Rogers, the big controversy over the world title was just part of the script. They later teamed up, proving there were no hard feelings, just business. Killer Kowalski might have looked scary and mean in the ring, but when he and Bobo made history wrestling in a segregated region, they did something much bigger than just put on a match. They helped move wrestling forward and break down racial barriers. That doesn't happen unless there's a lot of trust between two performers. Dick the Bruiser had one of the roughest styles in wrestling. He and Bobo looked like they were beating the life out of each other, but they also teamed up plenty of times, including in big matches against guys like Bobby Heenan and the Sheik. You don't stand shoulder to shoulder with someone in front of a packed crowd unless you're confident in them. Then there was Johnny Valentine, a guy known for his hard-hitting style. His matches with Bobo were tough and physical. But when Valentine got hit with a fireball from the Sheik in 1973, it was Bobo who ran into the ring to check on him. That moment wasn't part of a story, it was real concern. A few months later, the two teamed up. So again, whatever hate fans saw on screen wasn't the real story. And now with Haystacks Calhoun, it's more obvious than ever. These two were never enemies. They were teammates, friends, and crowd pleasers. If they were ever on opposite sides of a match, it was just to put on a good show. That's what wrestling is all about. Looking at all these examples together, one thing becomes really clear. The so-called hatred Bobo Brazil had with his opponents wasn't real. It was all part of the performance. The rivalries were scripted, the anger was acted, but the respect, that was real. Bobo had a reputation for being one of the most professional, well-respected guys in the business. He handled himself with dignity, didn't let the racial discrimination of the time shake him, and earned the admiration of fans and fellow wrestlers alike. He was called a gentleman, a class act, someone you could trust in and out of the ring. So when fans talk about the people who hated Bobo Brazil, what they're really remembering are the incredible performances. The matches that looked so real, They made you forget it was all a show. That's the magic of professional wrestling. Two people step into a ring, pretend to hate each other, and create something unforgettable. Bobo Brazil understood that magic, and so did the men he worked with. Their feuds weren't about personal grudges. They were about giving the crowd something they'd never forget and doing it together. That's not hate. That's professional respect. And that's what made Bobo Brazil a legend. If you enjoyed this look into wrestling history, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and ring that bell so you never miss an upload. Got a favorite Bobo Brazil match or moment? Drop it in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you want more stories like this, let us know who we should cover next. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.